Hi, I'm Dennis Weiss for Eagle Communications. Welcome to our town. We have the good sheriff, Gareth Hoffman, in with us today. Good morning, Gareth.
Good morning to you. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. You look mighty fine in your uniform.
Thank you.
Yep. I never know what you're going to show up in. Sometimes you're suit and tie, sometimes you're in a uniform, but I'm always pleased to see you.
Yeah, variety.
That's
we like
good.
a variety.
That's right. It's the spice of life, they say.
There you go.
Yeah. So I invited you here under the premise we're going to talk about the future of law enforcement. You know, I thought of this as on the way in. I remember interviewing you as a candidate.
Yes.
And in fact, I used some words that you said during that interview again last week. And I say again because I repeat them often. And what you had said during that candidate's interview is that you believe that Dickinson County deserves the law enforcement it wants. And the election was a chance to vote for what kind of law enforcement they wanted. I thought it was kind of a profound statement then, and I find it applies to many things in a community. And I said it last week in economic development terms. We deserve to have the community that we want to support. So I think that kind of falls into what our topic is today, and that's what law enforcement is versus back when we first met over 15 years ago, and what it looks like in the future. And there's been some big changes.
Yes, yes. I remember that conversation well, actually. Of course, that was my first time sitting down under the bright lights.
Right.
But and my statement, I think, was something to the effect of people deserve what they're paying for. Mm-hmm. You know, and I referred that back to something as simple as a steak dinner. Yeah. If you're buying a $20 steak, you want a $20 steak, not a $5 steak. And as simple as that sounds, I think law enforcement is kind of the same way, and we should operate under that same kind of theory, and that's do the best we can do with what we have and give people what they want and deserve. Mm-hmm. That's always a challenge, of course. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's probably gotten any easier since that conversation.
No, I don't think so.
Although my theories haven't changed, there's definitely times where, you know, it's a struggle to meet that demand, because I think the demand has gotten much larger.
Yeah, the size of the job has grown, hasn't it?
Yes.
You know, I think back to when we very first met, and you were a sergeant, I think, wearing a uniform, not that color, but about the same sort of gear, a little more gear on the belt maybe.
Yeah.
But anyway, so at that time, every small town around us had their own law enforcement of some variety, whether it's a chief of police, part-timers, or all sorts of things. But every place that called herself a town generally had somebody that was their law enforcement. And law enforcement was different because we were different as communities. Now, really, you look around us within reach. The sheriff's department's been covering Solomon for a long time under a contract. You recently started covering, Hope was what, 5, 6, 7 years ago maybe?
Time flies. Yeah, probably about 7.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So and Enterprise just recently. So, you know, that falls into the topic of our conversation.
Right. While
many years ago it was fairly easy for a small town to have somebody that was their law enforcement. The demands that the public, me, puts on law enforcement has grown to such a state that it's so hard to do.
Right.
You really need more modern, more people, more equipment, more accountability, deal with higher liability, all of that stuff. It's a big difference.
Yeah. Yes, we did recently contract with Enterprise. Obviously, they were, I think, having struggles trying to find their own police department and what they thought would be a good fit, good applicant, good chief, whatever the scenario may be. And, history had kind of gone on there for a while where, they were struggling with the turnover and not having longevity with the local police department. And that led them to us. I think it'll work out. Obviously, change is hard, but you're exactly right. And that's kind of what I mean when I say the demand has gotten much greater. I'm not saying it's right, and it's really unfortunate in many ways that the small towns can't maintain those local police departments. I still think there's value in it. I totally understand the citizens feeling that way, that they want their own local police
Sure.
departments. But the change in the profession, you know, in regards to training, it's just not getting to where it's cost effective anymore for those small towns to try and meet that demand.
You know, we are in a media era. We see everything on TV, the internet. Anything that happens in the world, anywhere, we see it in Talmadge tonight. So I think that's a huge difference. And the other thing is that device that's pointing at us, that camera over there. People are so used to video and so used to video access to people, including on their smartphones. You know, and everybody's got a better camera than we started this program with right here in their hand.
Absolutely.
And people have the perception that video is a 100% accurate representation of what happened. And you and I know that's just not the case at all. It's only a very small portion of what happens, and it leans towards what your eyes want to believe versus the complete totality of what's happening.
Right.
And it's a different thing. But that didn't exist when we were riding around putting stray cows back in the pasture either.
Yes, correct. You know, it's funny, when I started, which has been about 23 years ago, we didn't have cameras on any level. You know, obviously no body cameras. That wasn't even talked about at the time. We didn't even have car cameras in our cars, and I actually was one of the few that pushed for car cameras at the beginning, because I could obviously tell that there were going to be times when it boiled down to, you know, your word against somebody else's, and that can be tricky, especially now.
Right.
I think, you know, obviously with everything that's going on in the world, social media, access to all of that information at the click of a button, you know, people are questioning law enforcement now. And so those types of things have become more of a necessity. But you're right, it's unfortunate that I think we're starting to get to a place where we think maybe that the electronics and the technology is the answer to all of our problems. I don't think that's the case. Does it make things better? Sure. But it's certainly not going to solve the world's problems.
You have presented to me privately, and I don't know if we've ever done it on camera, and Chief Heimer has as well, the power of community policing.
Yes.
And that is a term used in law enforcement, but the practical reality of it for somebody that doesn't know a thing about law enforcement, maybe watching today, is that's the officer simply getting out of the car, walking and talking to people and showing their humanity. Right. And then dealing with people face to face instead of behind the glass of the cruiser.
Right. Yeah, when I got elected and came in, of course, you know, you've always got your theories or your vision, I guess. And that was one of the things that when I say we, myself and the undersheriff had talked about, and that was how do we effectively build on the community policing theory, and realizing that it was nothing new. We just weren't doing it, in our opinion, at the level that we felt we should be doing it. And I say it's nothing new. It was actually created by a gentleman by the name of Sir Robert Peel, I believe, in the 1800s. So I find that interesting that theory has been in place for that many years, and we still haven't become maybe as effective at it as we should be. So we did that. We worked on that. We're still working on that. It's a work in progress, but you know, it's about getting out of your car, stopping in a business, talking to somebody, not necessarily about a problem that they've had, but just merely talking with them, establishing a relationship, meeting with the kids in the schools, establishing relationships. And it was interesting because I just had a meeting with some of the business owners in Enterprise because of the changeover. And the thing I took away from that meeting, it was just like a broken record, for lack of better terms, and one of their biggest concerns was, and rightfully so, by losing our local police department, we feel like we're losing a relationship with people that we see every day. And so I, of course, told them that those are things we're working on. I think we're doing a way better job than we were 6 years ago. And I think it's going to even get better as we go, as we change, just kind of change the way that people think, including us, the way we think of what our job description is, as well as what the community thinks that is, and finding that happy median in there.
We've had this conversation before, but I guess growing up on a farm and a ranch, it's always been a point of focus for me on how many calls for service that people get about cows out, horses out, cats out, dogs out. And I'm a lot more tolerant maybe about horses and cows out on the road than I am my neighbor's cats in my yard.
Right.
So taxation is what pays for you. The amount of money we spend and the services we get really are our choice as a community, and it's down to the individual on what they pick up the phone and ask for.
Right.
I don't know that people have an understanding as well as people who wear the uniform do of what that trade-off cost is.
Right.
If I'm doing this, I can't be doing the other thing. And community policing is one of them. I mean, walking in front of somebody having a friendly conversation is a great deal different than trying to separate two neighbors who are arguing about a cat in the yard.
Right.
It's a completely different experience
Right.
that has different outcomes for our community.
Yes. And one of the things, that's been talked about a lot as well among ourselves, and we learned, we hadn't thought about it probably before, but what we learned is it's very hard. It's easy to put together numbers and collect data as to what's happening or what has happened.
Right.
But when you talk about being proactive and trying to be out front of those things that have happened, your burglaries, your thefts, whatever the scenario may be, when you try to collect that data in regards to your community policing or what perhaps that has prevented, you can't do it.
Can't do it. It's hard to do.
It's difficult to measure the value in having those conversations, establishing those relationships, and trying to be in those small communities prior to the events actually happening.
Boy, he stumbled into one. So here we go. We're in the service delivery business over wires, coaxial wire, fiber wire, but it's a device that gets services to people. We have technicians that go on service calls, something's broken, and we have technicians that go look for problems and fix them before they happen.
Right.
We enter work orders routinely when a customer calls us and says, I have a problem, and they type up a work order and it goes out. Oftentimes, we don't put work orders in on the maintenance issue, on I saw something so I stopped and fixed it issue.
Right.
And that's kind of my pet peeve. I go, you've got to enter that as a work order. Well, I just fixed it. Okay, but we have to know that you did, because the allocation of that time, preventive maintenance, determines the outcomes for how you then allocate resources for the future. So if you're ever going to go in front of the county commission and talk about, I need resources for community policing, you have to have some data.
Right.
You have to say, here's the number of stops we make to talk to people that didn't result in an arrest or a ticket or a warrant served.
Yeah, and it's very, like I explained, tried to explain, it's a huge learning curve for the community to have us in that type of setting.
I would agree.
And it's been a huge learning curve for us as well, because what happens is law enforcement, or at least here, when it went, at a certain level or a certain way for so many years, not saying bad or good or otherwise, but not necessarily this same type of theory in regards to community policing. And you have people that are used to law enforcement officers that are used to always being on the move. I feel like I need to be out writing a ticket, or I feel like I should be out, doing this on this case or that case. You get caught up in that stuff and you lose sight of taking an extra 10 minutes or 15 minutes just to talk to somebody about maybe something that has nothing to do with a case, but just talking. I think for a while, and probably still to this day to some extent, some officers kind of start to feel lazy. Well, gosh, I'm not doing what I'm supposed to be doing. Our argument is, yes, you are. You are. Although we can't measure the benefit of that yet, we still believe there's value in it.
Doesn't mean you don't know it works.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah. You know, we'll flip over to, thank God we live in Abilene, Kansas. We've had this conversation before, both privately and on camera a bit. We're so glad that law enforcement is your career here in Abilene, Kansas, and not in Detroit.
Absolutely.
But we have to face the fact that the world changes around us, and the adaptation of law enforcement to the greater risks that exist in the rest of the world, who are very mobile. We have an interstate highway right there. Lots of people moving everywhere. One cannot exist with the Barney Fife, one bullet in the shirt pocket mentality, while still at the same time needing to be that person who can relate to fifth graders in a DARE program.
Yeah.
That is what law enforcement faces today.
Yeah.
And we saw last night, as this is being filmed on a Thursday, last night in Ferguson, Missouri, 2 officers who were standing in a line were both shot from darkness. Those sorts of things enter officers' minds every day, and rightfully so.
Sure.
You know, training dictates that you presume that every stop is one you have to have maximum self-protection, because the officer deserves to go home tonight,
Right.
no matter what. They have a right to go home to their wife and children every night. I don't think, unless you've been there, that's understandable.
Correct.
Yeah, so I use this occasion as you and I sitting here to say, you know, that's a training requirement that takes dollars and time that did not exist when I signed up to help the Sheriff's Department over 15 years ago as a reserve.
Right.
Wasn't there in Dickinson County.
Yeah.
Well, it's here today. It's everywhere today because
Absolutely.
of the mobility of people. So as a sheriff, tell me, how do you deal with that in training people to that level of professionalism while keeping them able to sit down with fifth graders in a DARE class?
Well, I think on probably a simple term, it starts, in my opinion, from merely the hiring process, in finding that individual that is a good fit. And you can have people who are maybe great officers, but maybe not a great fit for where we are. For that very reason, he maybe not so good with the fifth graders, but maybe great with traffic or solving burglaries or whatever. But in this community and in this environment, because we are not the size of an agency who has the flexibility to have a traffic division, an investigative division, and break a department down into those special areas, we have to find that guy who we hope is a great fit across the board to be able to do all of those types of things. So from the selection process, I mean, it starts immediately from the selection process. I think the other thing is obviously that the police academy now, when I went through, was 8 weeks. 23 years ago, now it's 14. So, I mean, they've obviously made changes.
Right.
They've obviously increased their curriculum to help better prepare officers for the changing trends. They come back out of the academy, and then, you know, we put them to work as within a training program within the agency. And that kind of fluctuates, you know, depending on that particular individual and you know, their rate of progression and when their training officer or we feel like they're ready to go out and start doing things kind of on their own. But I keep repeating the word demand, I guess, but that's really what it is. When they can meet the demand of what the expectations are, not only from us, but more importantly from the public. And it's getting more difficult. I think now law enforcement is more of a profession than it was 20 years ago. I think people are expecting a certain level knowledge and education that maybe was not in place 20, 25 years ago.
You know, you said it starts in a hiring process. My wife asked me one time, she said, reading an article, and it was about pay for law enforcement, and she said, why would anybody do that? I said, there really is only one reason, and that is because they have a love for it, and then it's up to that department to train and channel that appropriately. Because if you look at risk versus reward in law enforcement, the reward side does not line up, and it probably never will.
Right.
If someone doesn't have a love for the act of law enforcement, as you have described here for the last 15, 20 minutes, they will never survive it.
That is correct.
They will come in and become disillusioned and leave because it's too hard, it's too demanding, and there's too many costs to the rest of your life.
Yeah, and that's one of the very specific questions that we discuss during interviews when we hire people is kind of down the path of why us, why law enforcement, why do you want to be here? It has to work. That person not only has to work well for us, but we have to work well for that person. Again, it goes back to that fit. And it has to fit both ways, because if it doesn't, you have no longevity. And but we hit on that a lot. Why do you want to be here, and why do you want to be in that profession? I've argued for many years that, and of course I suppose a lot of your long-term law enforcement people would agree, but we ask, you know, what's in your heart, because that's what it's about.
Right.
If this is in your heart, like you said, if you love it, you're probably going to be successful. If you don't, if this is just a stop along the way, don't bother, because it's not gonna work.
Well, Gareth, I appreciate you taking time to do this. We need to do it again in the near future, because we haven't even talked about incarceration demands on our county versus how it used to be.
Right.
And there's significant change here for us to deal with that.
Yes.
Brad Hoffman brought it up when he sat here. I intended to get to there with you, but we're frankly out of time.
I rattled too much?
No, you did perfect. We talked about the important stuff. Now we'll get down to the ugly, the next trip, which is we have to deal with the facts of the society in which we live, and the place to house them is one of it.
Yep, it is.
All right.
And always probably will be.
Always will be, unfortunately. So thank you, my friend, for coming in.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Very pleased to have been associated with the Dickinson County Sheriff's Department for all these years, and you've done a great job leading them. So thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that
Have a
very
great
much.
day.
Thanks.
Folks, we appreciate your watching. For Eagle Communications, I'm Dennis Leese.